So, good evening and welcome to King's Business School for this wonderful event. My name is David Aikman. I'm the director of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance here at King's College. And together with our colleagues at OnFIT, we've organised tonight's lecture. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Joachim Nagel to give tonight's lecture on the economics and the future of economic and monetary union. Dr. Nagel is, of course, president of the Deutsche Bundesbank and a member of the governing council of the ECB. So it's a real pleasure to have you join us here.
So, let's see. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be with you today and to speak in these beautiful and history-filled surroundings. We are living in turbulent times once again. I guess almost everyone can name factors currently adding to overall uncertainty. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, the comeback of high inflation, high public debt levels, and most recently, financial market tensions as well. In such times, it is especially difficult to prioritize actions that need to be taken. In my speech today, I will focus on a number of issues that I deem important right now. I will shed some light on current economic developments, then I will of course comment on inflation and monetary policy. And I will focus especially on fiscal developments and the discussion surrounding fiscal rules, which, as you may know, is a particular obsession of central bankers. One topic that is probably of particular interest to you is the most recent development in financial markets. Whenever banks get in distress or fail, questions inevitably pop up about proper risk management, about sufficient regulation, about contagion risks. And rightly so. It is our duty as central banks to probe the stability of our corners of the global financial system. As far as I can see, the majority of risk managers in banks have done a decent job of coping with today's challenges. Regulation in the euro area is far stricter now than it was 15 years ago. The euro area banking sector is resilient with strong capital and liquidity positions. And despite the events that we have witnessed in the past 15 days, contagion risks to euro area banks appear to be low. We will continue to monitor closely the developments in financial markets. And we are ready to act if need be. With that, I would like to move to issues more important in the long run. In my speech today, I will elaborate on some of the current challenges facing the European Monetary Union, with special focus on two public sector agents influencing the macroeconomy, monetary and fiscal policies. I will draw particular attention to the ongoing debate about reforming European fiscal rules. But every speech on general issues is naturally held in specific times and circumstances. So let me begin with a few words about the economic and inflation outlook in Europe, as well as about our latest monetary policy decisions. Last year, the euro saw an expansion of 3.5% in economic activity in the euro area. The main factor behind the economic expansion in Europe was the lifting of COVID-related restrictions. However, high inflation dampened private consumption. This was, to some extent, due to energy crisis caused by the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Initially, during the late summer, there were deep concerns that a cut in the Russian energy supply would cause a severe recession, at least in some euro area countries. Fortunately, European countries, and Germany in particular, made considerable progress in finding alternative gas suppliers and in filling gas storage facilities before the winter. Thus, the most negative scenario was avoided. Nevertheless, the energy crisis provoked not only surging energy retail prices and higher production costs for firms. It also created considerable uncertainty and made production planning for firms more difficult, especially for those with high energy consumption. These dampening factors had an effect in the second half of the year especially, while the growth effects of the lifting of COVID restrictions petered out. For this winter, we expect economic activity in the euro area to increase marginally. According to the ECB's economic projections published last week, GDP in the euro area will grow only by 1% this year. It should be taken into account, though, that the current financial market tensions imply greater uncertainty around projected figures. One of the most striking economic features of the recent past is the comeback of high inflation. To be fair, the high inflation did not emerge only because of the energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. The inflation rate had already accelerated in the summer of 2021. As the world recovered from the unprecedented economic slump caused by the pandemic, supply chains were under stress. Together with expansive monetary and fiscal policies, the rapid recovery pushed up energy prices. Moreover, demand for certain goods and services increased strongly. Supply bottlenecks and price increases were the result. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, energy prices skyrocketed. Furthermore, the war and its consequences disrupted some other supply chains. In particular, the energy price shock heated up inflation even more. The figures clearly demonstrate how exceptional last year was. According to the IMF, 2022 consumer prices in advanced economies rose by 7.3%. That was the highest increase in almost 4 decades. In the United Kingdom, the consumer price index even rose by more than 9%, and when I'm not wrong today, I heard the numbers for February they were even higher than the months before. In the euro area, the harmonized index of consumer prices rose by 8.4% on an annual average for 2022. Initially, high inflation rates were driven mainly by energy and food prices. Energy prices recently decreased, and with them headline inflation rates. However, inflation keeps becoming more broad-based. We can see this from core inflation, which excludes energy and food prices. Core inflation keeps rising in the euro area. In February, it stood at 5.6%. Overall inflation rates will remain high in the near term. According to ECB's economic projection, the inflation rate will average 5.3% this year. This is more than double our medium-term inflation target of 2%. According to the projection, we will have to wait until 2025 to see inflation approach our target by decreasing to 2.1%. Moreover, the projection still contains significant uncertainty and in particular upside risks. For example, high commodity and production prices could be passed on to consumers to a greater extent than previously expected. Wages may increase even more strongly than assumed in the projections. Given this outlook, the Governing Council of the ECB could not simply assume that high inflation will return to the target level of 2% on its own. On the contrary, monetary policy has to act decisively. That's why the Governing Council of the ECB delivered 6 interest rate increases over the last 8 months. Monetary policy rates increased by 350 basis points, the largest hike sequence ever in the euro area. However, increasing the policy rates is not the only instrument we have at our disposal. In the first half of 2022, we discontinued net purchases under our so-called PEP and APP asset purchase programs. This meant that security holdings under these programs remained largely constant. From this month on until June, we are reinvesting only about 50% of maturing assets under the APP. So our balance sheet is starting to shrink gradually, phasing out one additional component of the previous expensive monetary policy. From July onwards, reinvestments in the APP could be further reduced. This would support the tight monetary policy needed to rein in inflation. With our monetary policy actions, we are dampening economic activity. This is not an unwanted side effect, but an important link in the causal chain of our monetary policy tightening. We have to tame inflation, and to do so, we have to be bold and decisive. In my opinion, our job is not done yet. If inflation develops as projected, further interest rate hikes have to follow in upcoming meetings. In the event that financial market tensions continue or spread to the euro area, we are prepared to respond to preserve financial stability in the euro area. The monetary policy of the euro system will do what is necessary to ensure a timely return to price stability. But it is not monetary policy alone that influences the inflation outcome. The former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, once said, "If central bankers are the only game in town, I'm getting out of the town." So let's have a look at the other important player of the public sector, fiscal policy. Before touching on some general aspects of the discussion on fiscal rules, let us take a quick look at the current policy mix in the euro area. Last year, we went through tough times. Fiscal policy was needed. Huge increases in energy prices and high inflation severely affected households and businesses. It was right to use fiscal policies to help those people who were hit hardest and could not help themselves. It was right to support vital businesses that otherwise would not have made it through the particularly difficult times. Fiscal policy has delivered quite forcefully. Sizable temporary measures were taken, and the fiscal support was, for the most part, relatively broad and untargeted. And on top, these measures were mainly financed through additional deficits. However, while expansionary fiscal measures are appropriate to restore stability in the case of a demand shock, this is not so much the case in today's circumstances. The current situation is characterized to a large extent by supply-side effects and, of particular relevance for monetary policy, by high inflationary pressures. In such a situation, expansionary fiscal measures risk fueling inflation further. There's a risk that monetary and fiscal policies will work against each other. Therefore, looking ahead, it is important that in the euro area the size of fiscal policy support is reduced as soon as possible. Any further support should be well targeted. The easing of tension in the energy market will assist in the reduction of fiscal support. And some measures, such as the German gas and the electricity price breaks, will be less costly than initially planned. It would be highly advisable not to use this kind of fiscal relief for other purposes, like other expenditures or tax cuts. They should instead contribute to lowering the high deficits. In this way, fiscal policy in the euro area can support the euro system's monetary policy by reducing the fiscal stimulus and by putting public finances on a more sustainable path. In general, not just in today's specific circumstances, fiscal policy is a major factor influencing how effectively the euro system fulfills its mandates of price stability. Monetary and fiscal policy have their interdependencies. Their policy stances can more or less be in harmony. In the best case, sound fiscal policy provides the necessary bedrock for monetary policy, also in a broader and also a longer term perspective. In the worst case, persistently unsound fiscal policy creates significant risks that make it more difficult for central banks to fulfill their mandate. Here we speak of the risk of fiscal dominance. What does fiscal dominance mean exactly? The higher the level of public debt becomes, the greater the pressure on central banks to maintain favorable financing conditions in order to prevent the state from experiencing a solvency crisis. If the central bank gives in to that pressure, it is no longer primarily following the goal of price stability. In an extreme case, the roles of fiscal and monetary policy are reversed. The central bank stabilizes government debt and the level of inflation is determined by fiscal priorities. Or, as the American economist Michael Woodford puts it, fiscal dominance manifests itself through pressure on the central bank to use monetary policy to maintain the market value of government debt. In the euro area, fiscal soundness is all the more important because a single monetary authority operates amid many sovereign fiscal authorities. Therefore, the architects of economic and monetary union not only relied on market discipline by emphasizing the no bailout principle. In addition, fiscal rules were established as an important feature of the monetary union to preserve sound public finances and to prevent fiscal pressures on monetary policy. The fiscal rules are enshrined in the European treaties. They were regularly the subject of controversy and have been repeatedly adapted and reformed over time. A frequent criticism was that the fiscal rules might be an impediment to public investment. Others criticized the rules as being overly complex and opaque. In my view, the fiscal rules were better than their reputation, at least when we look at their substance. The quantitative budget ceilings were suited to ensuring that high debt ratios fall swiftly. However, they were insufficiently binding and their application was often the result of political negotiations. The results were not convincing either. Highly indebted countries failed to reduce their debt levels even in good economic times. Currently, the rules are still suspended until the end of the year. During the pandemic, the general escape clause from the Stability and Growth Pact was activated. In parallel, a reform process was launched. For that purpose, the Commission initiated a consultation process in 2021. The Bundesbank also contributed its proposals to this process. Our main recommendations were to make the quantitative targets more binding, with less discretionary exemptions and more stringent implementation. Moreover, we suggested allowing for more deficit finance investment expenditure when debt ratios are sufficiently low, and national rainy day funds to enhance flexibility for fiscal authorities. In addition, we proposed making fiscal rules more binding, for example, by transferring fiscal surveillance to an independent institution with an exclusive focus on debt sustainability, such as the European Stability Mechanism. Last year, the Commission presented its first reform proposal, which saw some contentious debate among member states. Last week, the Economic and Financial Affairs Council, ECOFIN, agreed on basic reform principles. I very much welcome its commitment to sustainable public finances and reduction of high debt levels. However, the current agreement appears to be largely based on the Commission's proposal of last November. I've not been convinced by the initial Commission proposals. I have expressed doubts that such an approach will lead to an improvement in fiscal rules, but instead, I believe it will do the opposite. The Commission proposes multi-annual fiscal adjustment paths. Those paths would have to be agreed by the Commission and every member state. Individual public debt challenges as well as reform and investment plans would have to be taken into account. In my view, such an approach is hardly compatible with the goal of a common, clear, transparent, and binding fiscal framework for all member states. It implies leeway for member states as well as a high degree of discretionary judgment by the Commission. Monetary compliance with fiscal rules would be highly complex, and results of sustainability analysis will crucially depend on initially defined assumptions. These challenges will be aggravated if the rules take reforms and investment plans into account. Fiscal targets would be mixed with other policy goals. In combination with the multi-annual setup, this raises concerns about whether backloading might become the new standard of fiscal efforts. I'm concerned that such a fiscal framework would fail to contribute to reliable reduction of high sovereign debt levels. And this would be a burden for our monetary policy and would leave us feeling exposed when it comes to dealing with future economic shocks. However, the discussion on reforming the current fiscal framework is still ongoing between the Commission and the member states. And similar concerns have been raised, not least by the German Finance Minister Christian Lindner. So we have to wait for the final agreement. In the end, the specific design of the rules, and especially and equally importantly, their implementation will determine the outcome. Now you may ask, what's next for the euro area? Well, unless there is a democratic legitimacy for the European political union, the future of the European Monetary Union relies on strengthening the existing governance framework. In general, progress is made in resolving the well-known drawbacks. The European Stability Mechanism was established to provide financial assistance if necessary. A macroeconomic imbalance procedure has been introduced and reforms have been implemented to mitigate the mutual reinforcement of problems in the financial sector and public finances. In particular, the single supervisory mechanism and the single resolution mechanism are designed to forestall financial distress in the banking system. However, further reform progress is needed to contain any detrimental impact of distortions from the government to the banking system. Ultimately, however, each member state remains responsible for its fiscal and economic policy. As regards the fiscal governance framework, fiscal rules should become less complex, less discretionary, and more binding. In my view, however, fiscal rules alone cannot ensure, together with monetary policy, price stability. That means financial markets have to play their part by pricing sovereign risks adequately and thereby support fiscal discipline. Borrowing at European Union level to finance current expenditure, such as with the next generation European Union transfers, should remain an exception. This guarantees that potentially rising risk premia for government debt constitute a significant incentive for sound fiscal policy. Capital market discipline would be helpful in this respect. The debt ratio in the euro area increased rapidly during the pandemic. Politicians have to find a proper way to bring it down. Sustainable public finances secure capital market access and avoid potential conflicts with monetary policy. I hope the current reform of the governance framework will not culminate in a rules-free setting. Sustainable finances are in the interest of taxpayers as well as fiscal authorities and central banks. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. From a central banker's perspective, fiscal rules are indeed very important. The economist Karl Brunner expressed this with the following words: the crucial conclusion from stability analysis suggests that a stable, non-inflationary monetary regime is unlikely to persist in the absence of a fiscal regime effectively containing the average deficit. In this context, the direction of the current reform process causes me concern. We will see whether the answers to the questions still under discussion will improve the outcome. And we will see how any new rules will actually be implemented. In my view, the European Union weathered the crisis of the last 2 years fairly well. The European Union countries reacted responsibly and successfully to the economic shocks caused by the pandemic and energy crisis. Certainly, we would not have been better off during the crisis had we been dealing with 20 different European currencies. Working together to find a common European response is worth the effort. I am firmly convinced that monetary union is beneficial to all members. Thank you very much.
Right, we have plenty of time for Q&A, which I'm sure you're all very keen to. You've all got questions ready for. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Nagel, for that excellent talk. I may kick off with one of my own, to use the prerogative that I have. The Bundesbank is famous for, well, for many things, but for one thing is its view that financial stability policy, macroprudential policy, should be separated from monetary policy. I suppose the events of recent weeks support that view. But I guess my question for you is whether you'd like to expand on this topic about whether monetary policy should take into account these developments that we're seeing in financial markets, I guess over and above what it's meaning for financial conditions.
Yes, thank you very much. I think last Thursday, when we decided to raise our main interest rates again 50 basis points, I guess we made it crystal clear that there's not a trade-off between the mandate we have to really get back to our 2% target and financial stability issues. I think there should be no doubt about this. And I believe not that this is exclusively the tradition of the Bundesbank. I think it was a joint understanding within the Governing Council that we should take here a clear stance and have that distinction between these two pillars.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay, let's take some questions. I propose we take maybe 3 and then you can respond to them. So, go ahead.
Phil Middleton from Omford. You talked a lot about inflation and inflation pressures.
Oh, wonderful.
And the ECB has recently confirmed the 2% target. Do you think that is realistic, that, or that the inflation target should be raised actually, and that 2% is really yesterday's target?
Phil, I would be definitely the wrong person when I'm not saying that I have the realistic understanding that we can come to that point that we will come down to the 2%. I think this is something we could achieve. I said it today in an interview for the Financial Times that inflation is a stubborn phenomenon. In a situation like that, you have to be even more stubborn from the monetary policy side. And I believe we showed that we have here this strong commitment. We raised 6 times now the interest rates. We started the whole process in July last year. So I believe there's more to come. So we have to cover a little bit more ground. This is what Christine Lagarde said in her press conference last week, and I couldn't agree more. It is a journey, and this journey is not over. But we will bring the inflation down to 2% for sure.
Crystal clear answer. Yes, over at the back. We can have a mic.
My question relates to your comments regarding the speed of the hikes and the uncertain times. So, given the uncertain times and how many hikes the central bank has laid out, wouldn't it be more advisable at this point to use the full forecast process and go towards a quarterly decision process versus acting at every meeting? Wouldn't it be more prudent given the circumstances?
I think first of all, inflation is still very high, and the projections we published in our last meeting, I think the core inflation rate, there's no signs for the moment, at least the core inflation rate is coming down, though we are above 5% for the whole Eurozone. This is much too high. So as I said, coming back to that, I guess there's more to do here. And taking your question, I think the communication was pretty clear last week that we have a meeting-to-meeting approach now. We will see how the situation might evolve over the next 6 weeks. Then we will have our next meeting in May, and then we will decide again. I think first of all, there was a lot of uncertainty last week. Now we are much better today. We will see how the next how the next weeks are going. But what I see at the moment, I have still the understanding that the underlying inflation is still very high. As I said, very stubborn, and I guess we have to keep our bold understanding that we have to do more. But checking each meeting the data that is coming in, and then coming to a new assessment, and then hopefully finding the right way to deal with this situation.
Okay, we have a question there, and I noticed we have a lot of students in the audience as well, so do put your hands up, and I'm very keen, and then I'll come to this gentleman here. So.
Thank you, Joachim Nagel from Nürnberger. Just coming at it from a slightly different perspective, social inequality post-COVID has been a real problem. Inflation is seen as a regressive tax. How do you, at the Bundesbank, balance rate rises, which are probably hurting the lower end, inflation, but also the inequality issues that are going on, and some say that should be a central bank mandate too?
To say that, or to answer your question, it was part of the first speech I gave when I became Bundesbank president, it was in January last year, so it was before the 24th of February, it was after the pandemic, and during that time we had the clear understanding that inflation will not go away and it will remain or rather high levels. So what I said in my speech, that inflation was there before the 24th of February, and I said that from the beginning that inflation has a social component and is not good for growth, so we have to do everything to bring inflation down. This is more or less the conditio sine qua non for a good development of the economy, and this is still the case. We are not there where we want to be, so we have to do our job, we have to fulfill our mandate. So this is our responsibility to really see that inflation is coming with a social responsibility as well, and this is what we highlight every day, what we highlighted in the past, and what I will more or less address to the politicians, that we have to do the job here. And as I said, and I alluded this when I said in my speech, that there is not only the responsibility on the monetary policy side, there's also a huge responsibility on the fiscal policy side, how to address this, not to spend too much, bring the fiscal deficits down, and as far as I can see this is also the understanding of the German government.
Okay, the gentleman on the left. Then we'll come to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terrific, thank you. David Walker from Citi. I wonder if you could maybe just make a few comments on what the regulatory response might be on liquidity rules for banks in light of some of the current failures and perhaps a link in with European government bonds. Thank you.
I think, first of all, we showed that in the past, if there are liquidity issues popping up, I think we have all the instruments to deal with that. We had many tender operations, long maturities. We accepted a broad range of collateral for our tender operations to really come up with the proper level of liquidity that is necessary. But to say it also very frankly here, we are still running the whole system with excess liquidity. So we are talking here about 4 billion euros of excess liquidity in the euro system. So there is not ample situation for the banks regarding liquidity. It is still a very, let me say, good level of liquidity. I do not see that constraints are coming from the liquidity side. But what I can promise to you is that if there is a situation where we will get into, let me say, a financial stability situation again, currently I do not see that something like this is coming, because I believe this is not a financial crisis what we had last week. There are some, let me say, idiosyncratic cases, but this is not a financial crisis. So we should really be careful to come to the assessment that we are into a new financial crisis. This is definitely not the case. But as I said, there will be a distinction between what we have to do on the monetary policy side and what is maybe necessary when it comes to financial stability issues. And we have the right instruments to deal with such a situation. This is for sure.
Okay, I think you two gentlemen were next. So, do we have the mic up front? Just here.
Thank you. Lukas Siegmann, undergraduate student and also president of the German Society. Glad to welcome you here. Following on from your point about the social and very immediately personal aspect of inflation and the uncertain economic times, how can businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, be reassured in some ways so they will still be able to obtain loans and get the maximum amount of certainty that they need to operate in this very volatile climate?
So thank you very much for this very good question. I think, first of all, I think business is becoming more competitive when it comes to loans. But we shouldn't forget that we are coming out of a decade or more than a decade where money was pretty cheap. And this is often forgotten that this was also a very exceptional phase. And so we should more or less realize that the time of negative interest rate, this time is definitely over. And we shouldn't exaggerate too much that it is now too costly. I think this is a kind of a mean reversion. We know in economics that there are often this phenomenon that it comes to, let me say, overshoot to a certain extent, and I guess we came out of a decade with a kind of an overshoot, and now we see this mean reversion process, and it is not over. So I guess, and I believe personally this is a healthy development, because with too much liquidity that is more or less feeding the system, it comes also with these negative side effects, and some of these side effects we saw last week, and this should also not be our intention, how to stabilize the whole system. So coming back to a question, what does it mean for small and medium-sized firms? Yes, they have to more or less show every day that the business model is the right one, and then I believe there will be no problems to get maybe no loans.
Thank you very much. My name is Adedoyin. I'm a student, I'm a graduate student here at MSc Banking. Contrary to what he actually asked here about the liquidity issue in the current global banking system, from your perspective, what is the ECB doing to actually protect, the banks in the region from contagion? We've seen some of the regional banks in the US where they're struggling with liquidity issues. What is the ECB doing to actually protect some of the banks in the union?
So it's not only the Euro system, it's not only the ECB or the whole Euro system. The European Union did a lot in the last 10 years. I think the outcome of the last financial crisis was better regulation, and that brought us better capitalized banks. They are in a better liquidity situation. So the banks in Europe are now more resilient than they were 10, 15 years ago. So I believe there is a lot of resilience. So I do not see at the moment there is necessity to do more to more or less prevent the Euro system, European banks from certain spillovers. And as I said, what we saw over the last 15 days is more related to idiosyncratic risks because of different reasons. I will not play this down, but I do not see at the moment that there is additional necessity to do more. There is a lot we have in our, toolboxes. And so I guess we can use this if necessary. And so there are often things like that. When bad things happen, you can also find the good things out of that. And one of the good things that showed the situation to me was that what we did in the past, we were often criticized regarding what we did on the regulatory side. I believe this criticism was wrong. I think I saw, or in my interpretation, we saw how helpful it is to have a banking system with high capital buffers, with a good liquidity situation, and that helped a lot in the past 15 days, especially the European banks. We have also resolution instruments and so on. I think everything is in place, we are prepared, but I do not see the necessity to do more on top of that.
So one more here and then I'll come to you on this side. So, Violetta?
I'm Violetta, I'm an undergraduate student here at King's also. I was wondering if you could speak about the asymmetries that may arise between different central banks within Europe and how the ECB might cope with that, similar to what happened during the 2008 crisis with different bond risk primes within the ECB.
This is also a very interesting question. I think there's often this understanding that that the Euro system, that the governing council, and often there's the Bristol system, there's this dysfunctional system because there are so many countries involved, and now we have 20 countries within the Euro system. But I can tell you, I think the last 12 months showed that there's also a kind of crisis resistance when it comes to decisions that are related to the decision of the governing council. I learned, and I'm president of the Bundesbank,
now since January last year, and I'm taking part in the Governing Council meeting. And I learned over this more than 1 year that there is a good team spirit, a good understanding what is our mandate, what we have to do. Is our price stability mandate to bring inflation close to 2%. And this is a joint understanding within the Governing Council. And yes, there are different countries, there are different views. There are large countries, there are small countries. But personally, I feel that is an advantage of that system to have these checks and balances of different views. And then after an intense discussion, we come to a decision. And over the last, as I said, 12 months since we raised this was the first rate hike in July last year, I think we showed our commitment and how the understanding of the whole Governing Council is. So I am pretty happy to be part of this team.
Very good. I know there were some questions here. Yes.
Hello, my name is Christian Schmoink. I'm a law student at King's College London. And I have a question regarding, you talked a lot about the long-term goals, bringing inflation down and ensuring price stability. But is there any short-term measures that have to be taken for this? Or is there any, that the long-term goal is clear and the long-term measures is clear, but is there any short-term measures and goals which have to be accomplished?
I think the short-term measures are pretty clear. It's coming back to a question here in the audience, so it's pretty much data dependent. What we see on the inflation side is the headline inflation coming down, what are the inflation expectations are doing, do we see something on the, let me say, the transmission process, how the interest rates are more or less translated into the economy, are the loan levels going down and so on. We have some short-term indicators and we are looking pretty closely into these indicators. But as I said, I think it takes time when we're talking about inflation. We all know maybe if we hike rates, the impact of what we are doing we'll see maybe in 15 months, maybe in 2 years. So that is something we have to realize. There's not a short success that we could expect here, but as I said, coming back to that, in a situation like that, we have to stay calm, we have to use the instrument we know, interest rates, and then at the end we will be successful.
That's 2 questions. Who's got the mic?
One question.
You got the mic. Let's have a couple over here. So David to start.
Thank you very much for the talk, David Marsh from Monfort. Now, I wanted to get into this issue about the fiscal rules because you put a lot of effort into talking about that. And another former governor of the Bank of England, Gordon Brittenton, he used to say, it takes 2 to tango. So you do need to have, as you say, both the fiscal and the monetary side somewhat aligned. And you put forward these ideas that the fiscal rules should be more binding and less tailor-made to nations, but also less complex. You've been very good at getting alliances, or at least getting some team spirit going on the council over the last year or so. Is there, do you think, a team spirit there for this issue about the fiscal rules? And what part can you play in this? After all, you are the president of the central bank. That's not your job. Can you help that? And then if I may just link this into the NGEU, it is linked, I think. You made the point you think this should be a one-off. Now, you are a man of the markets, Joachim. You know that the markets want this to be permanent. At the moment, the legal position is that it should not be permanent. There's only, I think, 4 countries that can actually borrow now more expensively themselves on the market than the NGEU. Most countries can borrow at below the rate of the NGEU. So isn't it really destroying the purpose of the NGEU if it remains an exception, a one-off, and ends in 2026 with the new borrowing? Wouldn't you as a market man say it should continue for a bit longer than that?
Thank you very much, David, for this question. I think, first of all, you asked me what I can do to help here. I think giving a speech like this and maybe giving some, let me say, insights from a monetary policy perspective, what is in our understanding helpful to bring inflation down. I think this is not only a job that could be fulfilled by the central banks. I think fiscal policy has to take responsibility here. And it was accepted that the fiscal policy was expensive last year. So the expansion of the, let me say, fiscal deficits, I think there was a clear understanding on the monetary policy side. Why should that, why this happened? Because of the pandemic situation and all what you had to do to more or less help the most vulnerable groups in each respective country of the European Union. But as this is one of the things I already said. I think this is not, let me say, my understanding that should get on for this year and for the next year. If there is new fiscal space, that shouldn't be used to do more spending. And coming back to that point, I think in a situation like that, you need fiscal rules. And if the fiscal rules are based on, let me say, discretionary or on a discretionary understanding, this is definitely not helpful. And all what we learn from the history of the European Union, if there is too much discretionary space, this is often used in the wrong direction. And so it needs simple, less opaque rules that really help to make the whole process transparent. And you're right. I think the debt levels are too high. And so on an average base, we have to bring the debt levels down for the countries of the European Union. And therefore, coming back to my point, I have the hope that the Commission, together with the countries of the European Union, come to, let me say, joint understanding, a little bit like this joint understanding we have in the Governing Council. I have still the hope that this joint understanding and the responsibility is also coming now into the discussion, and we will have better rules compared to what we had before.
What about the NGEU?
Okay, the NGEU, I think there are good reasons why we have this this program. I think the NGEU, I believe, is an important step forward for a certain special task. But also what I said for the last year when we offset the fiscal rules, I think this program should also be seen as a, let me say, a kind of an exemption.
Two rows back.
Hi, Elizabeth, undergraduate law student as well. Kind of drawing again on this issue of social inequality, and also in Germany, the Green Coalition, and in the EU, the Paris Agreement, which require for innovative approaches within businesses, and maybe require banks to give out loans to businesses that may not prove to be stable, or that we don't quite know where they're going to go just yet. How's that compatible with this need for stability and liquidity in the long term, and this political agenda that is important and clearly very present?
I think the whole issue of transforming the economy into the direction of a more sustainable economy, I think this is the most important question of these days. And I think also monetary policy has to ask itself, what is the role of monetary policy? Let me make 2 points. First of all, we have to accept and realize what is our mandate. Mandate is price stability. This is for sure. This is why we have an independent role. And this independent role, I think this is of utmost importance. But we have also, in my understanding, a responsibility when it comes to this question and the things you mentioned. And so what can we do on the monetary policy side? I think we can do a lot when we are talking about the regulation of banks. We can incentivize banks and make clear that when banks take certain risks that might come in the future also with risk for the banks. When maybe the investment you're doing is more maybe not green or not sustainable in the way we should more or less perceive such a maybe should perceive such a business. This is maybe one thing we could do on the regulatory side. And then we have to ask ourselves what we can do when we're talking about the implementation of monetary policy. So the Eurosystem already said that we do a lot on how we more or less classify certain collateral we use for our monetary policy operations. I think this is also very helpful. Then on top of that, what we can do on our portfolio side, the assets we have in our portfolio to also get into a more sustainable direction. But I have also to be fair here. This is not, maybe we are not in the driver's seat here. This is definitely a political task. And that should also be understood. Because it could be also a wrong thing to put too much, let me say, responsibility on the central bank side. Because then there's a danger, maybe we might disappoint. Using or losing then a little bit some of our credibility, trust, our most important asset. So we should more or less see that there are central banks, they have their mandate, we can help. But as I said, coming back to that point, the responsibility is definitely on the political side. We are not in the driver's seat here.
Great question. Okay, I think there's probably room for two more. So you definitely had your hand up for a long time, so I'll ask you.
Thank you very much. I'm Eduardo Donardi from Schonfeld. I'm also a PhD student at NSC. I was just wondering if you could, of course, thank you very much for your initial remarks where you commented about the incoming economic and financial data and the underlying inflation situation. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on what your sense is, where we are standing regarding the third pillar of the reaction function that's been of the central bank that's been laid out by President Lagarde in the recent speech, which is the transmission of monetary policy. Where do you think we are, given also the heterogeneity across member states and of this speed of transmission?
I think it's clear that there is this heterogeneity within the Eurosystem. That was there, this heterogeneity from the beginning when we started this this monetary union. I think this is not new, and so I believe this is any time when we are discussing monetary policy issues, this is part of the discussion when we come to a conclusion to evaluate this heterogeneity and then find the right way forward. So coming back to what you said and what was already been said by the President, Christine Lagarde, is that now we're definitely in a situation where we have this meeting-to-meeting approach. I think we came out of, let me say, an episode of 2 complicated weeks. We have to see what impact might come out of that. Is that more or less influencing the monetary policy stance, if there is maybe an impact on the transmission process. And I believe personally that this is a good way forward. I said it today in an interview that I believe that what I see, at least at the moment, is that the underlying inflation is still pretty high, core is not coming down. But I also said today, the first time, that we are approaching, I will not speculate here, the restrictive territory, what we have to do in the Eurosystem when it comes to fight against inflation. But what is important to me, when we are approaching this restrictive territory, I do not know when we will more or less be there, to use that constructive ambiguity. But what I know is that when we are there, we have to stay there, not to come down too early. And I do not understand the speculation that was already been made by some commentators that, well, is there maybe a probability that there will be more or less a situation is coming maybe this year or early next year that we have to bring down the interest rate level again. I do not see this, and I believe this discussion is coming much, much, much too early. So the data-dependent way forward, I think this is the best way to deal with this situation of uncertainty.
Okay, I'm afraid a final question from me, because then we'll have to, when we can mingle and have drinks and discuss further. We've got a number of budding students of economics and finance in the audience here. What's your advice for them on what topics should they be working on?
Oh, goodness. I think the students that are sitting here, they're doing their studies in, I guess, one of the most interesting times that I can more or less oversee over the last 2 decades. When I started more or less my career at the Bundesbank 20 years ago, it was a super calm time. Compared to these days, pretty boring. Then we had the Lehman situation. Then we had the crisis of the debt situation of some countries within the European Union. And any time I thought after the Lehman collapse, okay, it couldn't get worse. Then I thought the same in 2010, 11, it couldn't get worse. Then we came to the pandemic and said, okay, it couldn't get worse. I hope not that this is maybe my forecast what is coming next. But nevertheless, I think there are so many interesting topics issued. Some of the question went into that direction. What does that mean for, let me say, the broader questions like sustainability, transformation of our economy? What does that mean for monetary policy? Also this interaction between monetary policy and financial stability, all these things. And then, not to forget our models. I think what we learned, I'm not sure if that was pretty new, but we learned it again if there is a structural break, if there is a new black swan, and all the models we used before were not so much helpful to deal with a situation like that. I think there are so many things to do. So your studies are perfect. It's a perfect timing for your studies, and love what you're doing. I think this is the most important thing.
An optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much.